September 2024. And obviously it's been a quiet week with hardly anything to talk about of interest whatsoever. Or for people in the real world who are actually on the planet, you'll have noticed the first draft of the Renters' Rights Bill, as it's now known, having been published with an idea and a stated goal of getting it through the entire process, aka receiving royal assent before the summer recess of 2025. So a realistic timeline for legislation, unlike Angela Rayner's unrealistic timeline before the election of day one, section 21 will be banned or whatever. My concern about all of that was always the fact that Rayner didn't even understand what the process was for passing a law, but that can't obviously have been true because she'd already been an MP for some years. But there we go. So I like to start each week with a quote, and this week I've gone with one of the great philosophers of all time, Bob Marley, and get up, stand up. Don't worry, I won't sing it. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight. And it's a little bit of a reminder that there are rights on both sides, realistically, of the equation. And whilst there's quite a lot of lies, really, that have gone on in terms of saying that things will get better for landlords here and landlords' possession processes will be beefed up, they haven't gone with the processes that have already been put in places like Scotland, where there has been a genuine attempt, actually, to improve the situation for landlords. As well, and try and make, apart from anything else, recovery of possession procedures and things like that a little bit better. But look, before I get started in anger, I am contractually obligated to mention to you our property business workshop on Tuesday the 1st of October. It's going to be a great one. It's almost like Rod and I saw the future on this one, because we're going to be talking about exit. But remember, we're not just talking about your own exit. I think this is a great time to be getting involved in the PRS, and I know millions of people would disagree with me on that front. But what are you going to know? What do you want to know about exits? Well, you want to know about how helping other people to exit, because believe me, there's going to be plenty of them. And like always, these situations are always the same. There's going to be much more fear before the Renters' Rights Bill becomes law. There's going to be so much speculation, everything's going to fall apart and all the rest of it. And do you know what, by the time we get there, it absolutely won't. But people will sell on the back of that fear. They will sell on the basis of it's all changed and this, that and the other's going on. And if you can help them to structure their exit correctly, I'm sure you can benefit from that in the short, medium and long term, realistically. And ultimately, so can they. Because apart from anything else, one of the things I see all the time when it comes to exit is that HMRC are going to take an unnecessarily large slice of the pie. Not through crafty schemes that you've got to pay dodgy non-tax advisors loads and loads of money for. Ultimately, it's not about that at all. It's about just making sure you only pay what you're due to pay, apart from anything else, because of the way you structure the sale, depending on what you're selling, depending on what wrapper you're selling it with, and all the rest of it. But anyway, that's enough about that. If you haven't already signed up, haven't already bought a ticket, the tickets are at bit.ly/PBWFOUR. There's still early bird prices for 2 more days only. So get on that link as quickly as you can if you haven't already booked. If you've been thinking about booking, get on with it, because the prices will go up by more than 10% this week coming. So please get on with it. Right, enough. As I said earlier, a bit of a quiet week, really, not much to talk about. So you didn't fall for that one and you're still here, so let's get on with it. There are claims here about seismic cataclysms that are going to wreck the UK rental market in real time, usually to get people to click on YouTube videos. Let's face it, you know this channel's not like that, and I prefer to have a robust debate around the truth, because I find the truth most useful in business and in life, apart from anything else. So anyone who's listened to or read more than a dozen of the many hundreds now of supplements that I've written and recorded will know that's not really my style. And there's a reason why I say keep calm and carry on every week, because I think that's the number one mindset that you need in property. But there is no denying that this redrafted Renters' Rights Bill will dominate discussions over the next 6 to 9 months before it goes through Parliament. And it's worth remembering at this point, we do have a 2-house system of government in the UK. I almost said the words 2-tier there, but it's been said far too many times this summer. An unwritten constitution. So convention dictates that in the Lords, you can be difficult for a while, batting things back, batting things forward. But then, ultimately, you roll over, especially in the face of such a big majority in the Commons. So there'll be a robust debate. Remember, there are a number of peers that have given up their official party affiliations and are now what they call crossbench, apart from anything else. And this is a crossbench situation. We've already had, 3 or 4 backs and forths in the Commons on the original bill, with lots of good things brought up. And those same things are going to be brought up again, but even more of them, because it's even more very unbalanced from the status quo as we stand today in the favour of the tenant. This bill is 98% in favour of the tenant. The only real good news for the landlord, to be honest, is what's not in there that some people feared would be in there. So before you sell your portfolios and move to Rio or Dubai or possibly Whitehaven, depending on the numbers at the moment, I think we just need to start this conversation with that in mind, and that will help us to keep calm. We've also got probably a once in a parliament or once in a decade or even more opportunity to actually be heard here at a political level. Conference season is coming up, and I'm working behind the scenes on some political comms and drafts with the hope of getting some traction with support from one of the UK's top buy-to-let lenders, who I can reveal are already considering not lending to non-portfolio landlords if the bill was passed in its current form. So, as I say, I'm not a sensationalist, but I think that's a pretty big deal. It's a massive deal for the whole sector. And in honesty, from an economic perspective, massive advantage for people already in, right? Massive disadvantage for people who would like to get in, realistically, if that was to happen. I'm not saying it's a probable outcome, but look, it's already on the slate this week from some lenders. So you need to consider how seriously some people are taking it, apart from anything else. That would be what we call in economics a barrier to entry, and it would be one mighty barrier to entry. If I operated solely on my own self-interest, then pulling up the old drawbridge would be a phenomenal result for me and my portfolio, and a phenomenal result for those with existing portfolios. But you know what? I don't. I wouldn't put the time and effort each week into painstakingly researching, writing, and recording this piece if I was that guy, right? I believe that would genuinely create a horrific imbalance for the tenant, a dystopian, dysfunctional market stuffed with extra economic profit for the likes of me. And I'm still willing to try my best to stop what would be one of some gigantic mistakes occurring that would lead to that situation. And you wouldn't find that from a public limited company director, I'll tell you that for free. So, before all of this, we do have to stick to the knitting. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's reason why there's structure to the supplement aside from anything else, because it hasn't exactly been a quiet week on the macro front either. So I'm going to press on, first of all, with the real-time market analysis. Always give a cheers to Chris Watkin. Chris, thank you for being you. Delivers week in, week out on these with some of his bonus content sometimes as well. Listings are still ploughing on, 38,600 across the UK, very much back to 2024 business as usual. This was reporting on the week after the bank holiday, remember, so this is like back to school week that we're reporting on here. Big numbers of listings, still maintaining that rough 7.5% difference from the number of listings in the average year between 2017 and 2019, which is the baseline, if you like, before the pandemic completely distorted the market. Net sales also outperformed, 29% better on net sales than the equivalent week last year, and just over 15% higher than the pre-pandemic market for the same week. So, yeah, lots of stuff going on, but also lots of stuff selling. And actually, if you look at it on the pre-pandemic basis, 7.5% more listings, but 15% more sales. So actually, the market's starting to rebalance a little bit in favour of the vendor, and it's not as much of a buyer's market as it's been. I think you probably know that if you followed it in any sort of real-time way over the past several months. So Chris is still leading on the sales prices with a 1.22% drop in price from April. So don't get carried around August pricing. Chris does not seasonally adjust his figures. So bear that in mind. You always expect, we saw a lot of cheaper stock coming to market in August because the agents simply operate on the basis that it's August. It's got to be cheaper in order to attract attention. There's not as many people around. Market's getting busier again now. And you see later on in the figures a massive increase in the listing price, although that's a London distortion effect of back to school week that happens in the figures every year. So this is the danger of doing week to weeks. You sometimes get distortionary effects, but if you know what they are, it's always good to talk about them and understand them. So I'm not changing my 5% capital growth for 2024, the 2024 market. I haven't seen a need to change it at any point this year. I'm still pretty convinced it's going to be pretty close to the nail when we get to, well, it'll be February 25 by the time we know the real ONS figures. I pay scant attention to Halifax and Nationwide, to be honest. While I do comment on them, I do think they do some good analysis, and they're more real time, obviously, but it's more about inspiring confidence in the market than them having any statistical robustness and validity to them, as we've seen from their terrible predictions over the past few years, including a dropping market for this year, according to the pair of them, which was just a nonsense prediction. Nonsense prediction in December 23, and even more of a nonsense prediction now. But there we go. So, listing prices dramatically back up, as I said, at the central London effect. Price reductions really moved. We were at 1 in 10 properties per month getting reduced last week. We're at 1 in 6.6 properties getting reduced now, so much more commonplace. That's over 100,000 properties a month that are being reduced. So understand how much stock there is out there to shoot at, folks, if you're still someone who buys off the open market. Houses are selling, they have to be fairly priced, and there has to be something to make them stand out. So if we move to the macro, this week was a biggie, right? The labour market report and unemployment growth or lack thereof. The RICS house price balance, which I like to report on, was very balanced. The comfort blanket of a gorgeous looking week in the gilts markets for the borrowers out there. All sounds very innocuous before I get onto the renters' rights bill, doesn't it? I'm going to keep it as punchy as possible because we need to leave room for this RRB. I just noticed that RRB is BRR backwards, which is a very interesting, funny how these coincidences occur in real life, isn't it? But unemployment figures, well, it was a week of mixed fortunes for the interest rate. As far as the figures were, generally speaking, good news for all participants who want a sensible and balanced labour market. Most of the economic consensus was very close. We saw what had largely been in the PMI job surveys and the wider PMI reports as a whole for July play out in real time. Headline rate of unemployment down to 4.1. That was what was expected. Average earnings, arguably more relevant at the moment because this is the Bank of England keeps citing this figure, dipped to 4% year on year. But again, when you look behind and you peel back the onion, I've made the argument for years now that I vastly prefer the figure without bonuses because COVID inspired so many one-off bonuses trying to keep people happy without racking up a year-on-year increased cost apart from anything else. So if you include the bonus, average is 4.4%, but that's because there were lots of NHS and civil service payments made in June and July 2023, which will now drop out of the figures next month when we report on them. So the without bonus is still up 5.1%, so still above that psychological 5% barrier. That's much more likely to be the real cost that's impacting companies in the economy. And north of 5% is still big. But the good news, if you like, is it's that 4% that it applies, depends if you're a pensioner or not, or approaching pension age, but that's what applies for the triple lock. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. So the employment rate moved back to 74.8%, which is much better. We've been down lower this year, although 76 is sort of where we really belong, I would argue, in this economy, but it's still nearer to where it needs to be. The direction of travel is good. Unemployment decreased. Inactivity also decreased back to below 22%, although we've still got a significant hundreds of thousands strong inactivity problem, which is based on a whole number of things, non-means tested benefits being one of them, quite frankly. So vacancies continue to drop as well. So it's 26 periods now in a row. That's effectively 26 months, but they report quarterly, if you like. So it's like rolling quarterly reporting. 26 months in a row where vacancies have dropped, but we're still at over 850,000 job vacancies, which is still above where we were in 2019. So still very much a buyer's market in terms of the employee, but nowhere near where it was. It's really calmed down, and it does appear to be more functional. This is where we want it to be. So regular pay grew by 2.2% if you apply CPI. So that's inflation adjusted from that 5.1% figure, which is a pretty sweet spot to be. The headline would be about 1.4 because that 4% is much lower than the 5.1. But as I say, the 5.1 is the real number, in my opinion. It's just a problem with how you measure statistics sometimes. And we've added 265,000 jobs in the last 3 months in the UK. That's the best quarter since November 2022 when, okay, I'm not going to start on it this week, I promise. But as predicted over recent months, the job market actually looks healthy. This weakens the case to cut interest rates if the economy is doing fine, although it doesn't look like an overheating jobs market at this time. But the if it ain't broke, don't fix it brigade, who tend to be on the more hawkish side, so they want to keep interest rates higher, do tend to frame the arguments in this sort of way. So growth, the 2 months that straddle the election have now had their results released, and they printed a big fat 0. Right, the expectation was about 0.2% for July, but the quarterly rolling 0.5% figure, which you'd have to think now all came from May pretty much because June and July did 0, still keeps everybody happy. The June 0% print wasn't a surprise. This was a bit more surprising. So leading up to the election, more uncertainty, not as much economic activity. The actual election itself, well, there's a couple of things there realistically. Number one, Thursday, on election day, does GDP drop anyway? I don't know the historical studies on that or whether there are too many of them, but it could cost you sort of 0.1% quite easily. Also, England got to the final in the Euros. That was a Sunday night. The Monday might not have been the most productive work day in the world. Of course, pubs and hospitality took more money, but the realistic economic impact of something like that is negative for the country. So bear those two things in mind. Also bear in mind the standard UK excuse gets wheeled out in these situations. The weather wasn't very good in July. We've had a very wet year, and that has probably impacted GDP in a number of ways. But it is a variable. It doesn't help GDP in the summer months if you've got not that great weather. So services grew by 0.1 for July, and they lost 0.1 in June. So that basically defines the economy. It's 80% of the GDP. We talk about construction because we're interested in construction, but it's 6% of GDP. So that's where it sits these days. Production output, construction output, both contracted for July. I wouldn't have expected that in construction because apart from else, the PMIs were so very positive. But just remember month to month, if something drops into June the 30th or it drops into August the 1st, instead of being in July, it could make a huge difference if it's a big contract. So it just depends. I don't read too much into month to month figures. I'm still pretty confident August will print either 0.2 or 0.3 in terms of economic growth based on what we saw in the PMIs. If I had to choose a number right now, I'd choose 0.2 for August growth. We'll find that out in a month's time, by the way. So the white box commentary in the ONS. So the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, do a survey in which this is how they find out all this information from bigger businesses. Businesses are usually required to respond by law. It's not an optional thing. But I'm not sure that you get thrown in jail if you don't report on it. And COVID, like it did with everything, messed with their systems apart from anything else on this front. But businesses can anecdotally report what played a part. Why did business think July played out as it did? It might offer some insight. It's not always quantifiable, but it's interesting. I talked about the Euros. That was a boost in arts, entertainment, recreation and retail. But some restaurants reported a negative because, of course, instead of going out for dinner, people decided to go to the pub or stay in and get a takeaway, apart from anything else. Lots more visited Paris, right, due to the Summer Olympics. That would help travel, but it wouldn't help GDP at home because people who otherwise might have been in the UK over the summer were in France. So you have to consider things like that as well. Time off for the Euros could have affected GDP. As I said, that unofficial bank holiday Monday after the disappointing final result probably would have cost more economically if England had won, interestingly enough. But it still will have had an impact because a number of businesses sort of gave it as a morning off or did this, that or the other. So the category I watch the most in the growth figures, which is, it won't surprise you, buying and selling, renting and operating of own or leased real estate, excluding imputed rental, that grew at a very small number for the month but remained contracting over the quarter. And this is manifested in the fact that, apart from anything else, I think the fourth biggest category of high street shops that have shut in the first half of 2024 is estate agents, because they had a tough time in 2023 and the market maybe is getting a bit better, but they're still absolutely fighting over landlord instructions. Whilst landlords using agents, that number is contracting. One, because of cost of living mortgage side of things, apart from anything else. And number two, the rise of something like open rent, which is now listing one of every 8 properties in the UK, which a lot of landlords are operating themselves, not using an agent to do. And of course, that, to me, that's been a bit of a no-brainer for a long time in terms of showing the property to the widest marketplace, because Open Rent put it on 225 odd portals. But this podcast is not sponsored by Open Rent, just to be clear. Other solutions are also available, but it is pretty good. So back to the rates point. No growth would suggest that base rate might be high enough to be stifling economic activity. So a zero print could say we need to cut rates in order to get the economy going. Now, the MPC at the Bank of England are likely to just write it off as this is what happened around the election. That's probably what I'd be doing. I was a little bit surprised by July's number because the PMIs were a bit better than that, but the PMI might have indicated intention post-election rather than actual activity. So let's see. But I'm confident August figures will be okay. And if they're okay, they're going to set the trend for the MPC meeting in November. Now, we've got the Bank of England committee meeting this week. I really don't expect the bank to cut rates this week. That would be a real surprise to me if they did. I never thought they would in this meeting, to be honest with you. And the economic consensus has now moved to be completely with me. The 65 economists that they survey, 0 of them think they'll cut the rate next meeting. There are still a few who think they'll cut in November and December. I'm absolutely convinced those people are wrong as well. 2 cuts I see as exceedingly unlikely unless something happens that we haven't priced in at the moment. 1 cut in November, look, it's the favourite outcome. 0 of those 65 also think we won't cut for the rest of the year. And whilst that's not my active prediction, you have to distinguish here between what people think is impossible. So 0 in 65 think that could happen. I think it could happen. I think it's got as much of a 20% probability that we have no cut in November. So it's 80-20. And this is what's difficult to understand about expected value and markets, and why most people should never ever attempt to place a bet on a market one way or another in their lifetimes, because what you need to do is look for situations of extreme value. And if an economist is willing to offer me 64-1 or 65-1, because I'm the only one in 66 of them who thinks we might not have a cut in November, then I'd happily take that bet, and I'd be wise to do so if my 20% probability is anywhere near correct. But there we go. So NISA, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, produced pretty decent monthly GDP trackers in pretty much real time. They're forecasting 0.2% growth for Q3. So I feel pretty good about that, because I didn't look at that before I did my prediction. I looked at it afterwards because I don't like to be influenced by these things. I am concerned by the Starmer and Reeves negativity weighing on business output. And I mentioned this last week. It did creep into the PMIs. I'll reserve judgment when the September PMIs are out. But look, I've definitely adjusted my own forecast downwards. And I don't think this looks like a bad number at all, as we now look like we probably won't hit the 2% growth for the year that I thought might work. And I thought it might work for some time, but let's see. So enough on the growth or the lack thereof. The brief pocket heat wave or something must have cheered the surveyors up in recent weeks. So as so often, it's the headline number that by definition makes the headlines. And in spite of a consensus of -14, we actually printed a positive number, a massive 1, a whole 1. The best number since September 22 when, not again. 1 is a good number for the business overall in the sector, I'd say. It's on the back of improved sales market activity. That's what the real-time stats told us throughout August. And it also cites recent modest softening in mortgage rates too. The expectation is more impetus. +15 is noted. An increase in new buyer inquiries in August. Newly agreed sales ticked up to +6 from -1 last month. Near term, that's 3-month sales expectations, hit +37%, and +45% see strengthening sales activity over the next 12 months. So there's no expectation in a slowdown in stock hitting the market, and that should also be noted for anybody selling anything. But as they split the data down, RICS note that Wales, the South East and the South West remain weaker, and they cite Northern Ireland and Scotland as leading the charge. The expectation of a price increase is now at over 50% upwards over the next 12 months. So remember how this survey actually works. That would mean 75% of respondents think prices are going upwards, with only 25% thinking they might go down or remain the same. This is the best reading since April 2022, and it's the most bullish sign in this survey. The writing is on the wall for an increasing market over the next 12 months. The net landlord instruction balance was again negative and slipped back from -9 to -21. And the net letting balance of +11, which is not seasonally adjusted, simply represents one more month when tenant demand is net upwards and supply of new units to the agents is net downwards. And remember, this is just the agents. Like I said, lots of landlords have been having to, or felt they've had to cut agents out of the process, rightly or wrongly. I think usually wrongly, because it means they're not valuing their own time. But, you know, if the numbers don't work, the numbers don't work, do they? So thoughts on rental increases are +39%, but the last 2 surveys has been +38%. So no massive difference, but statistically, historically, still pretty high. And that's enough for the RICS balance, really. The gilts. It was a pleasing week. We opened at 3.701 on the 5-year, and we closed at 3.508, down almost 20 basis points for the week. I'd love to see it below 3.5, of course we would, but it's pretty lush. There was a tiny uptick on the basis of the employment data because we saw that strong job creation, but then there was a much bigger drop on the revelations of zero growth compared to the consensus of 0.2, and nothing else really moved the needle after a Monday that trended downwards all day, which started our week off. Thursday we closed at 3.53 on the 5-year yield, and the 5-year SONIA swap last traded at 3.417, which preserved that beautiful 10 basis point discount and moved into that glorious territory under 3.5%, which opens up more possibility for more cuts to the interest rate. So remember what I say, this could put 5-year buy-to-let funding down to about 5.4 at the moment. So I'll repeat what I repeat always in these situations when you have a big drop. If you haven't got to offer yet on any refinancing, right, make sure your broker's checking before you get to offer. Have the rates come down. These product rates will come down. I don't think in the next 7 days they'll particularly be coming down, because we've got a Bank of England meeting and the Federal Reserve have got a meeting, and those things will have an impact. If the Fed only cut 0.25%, which is strongly where I think they'll be, and the Bank of England don't cut, as I and pretty much everybody else now, finally now they've got the message, thinks that will be as well, that probably won't move the needle that much. It might raise the gilt yield a little bit, because in America it's still a bit of a coin toss, according to the experts, between a 0.25% cut and a 0.5% cut. I'm leaning on a 0.25% cut because I don't think they're not committing when they've made a mistake. And I think they probably have made a mistake waiting till now to cut, but 0.5% basically puts your hand up and says, yeah, we got it wrong. 0.25% says, nope, this is how we're doing it, folks, and you don't like it, but tough luck. And politically, for their own reputational management, I worry that plays too much of a part in the rate setting committee for the Federal Reserve. But of course, that's just my thoughts on it. That's because human beings are involved ultimately. The harder part is working the vote out for the Bank of England. You'll know that I like to try and do that. I'm going to punt that we'll be at 7-2 in favour of the hold, because I think Dave Ramsey will still find a reason to cut. And I know that Swati Dhingra will, you can absolutely take to the bank that she will find a reason to cut. She's very much on the cutting side of the fence, but I think the others may well move back into line. Could see as little as a 5-4 in favour of holding, but I don't see that happening. I don't think the governor's for moving this time round. We'll see, and will the deputy governor be influenced by that or trying to influence him? I don't know. This is the game of chess that gets played at the MPC. I don't think it will move the needle much, but we do have the inflation rate on Tuesday, which will change things depending on consensus versus reality. But anyway, that's the macro. It's time to get into the real meat for this week. I think the macro this week did show us why it's worthwhile looking at the PMIs and trying to stay in touch with the real-time figures, because a lot of this played out in very, very similar to the real-time figures, or didn't surprise us too much to the downside. So, into the deep dive, into the renters' rights bill, the one you've all been waiting for, or not waiting for, depending on your viewpoint. A little bit of a caveat first of all, right? No bill is law until it's received royal assent. There is a system, there is a process. Lots to do before this one is written up. There will be lobbying, a limited amount, and almost all by institutional landlords, but there will be lobbying. There will be pushback because housing is always such an emotive topic. There is time here for some of these potential mistakes not to be made. Decisions in this game are not made in the moment or on a dime. They are made in time. And over many of the last years, threats to sell up, or broadcasts of intention, if you prefer to call them that, haven't really played out, in honesty. What has occurred is exactly what Mark Carney's Bank of England said would happen. Interest rate sensitivity is much larger in the PRS than it is for people's personal homes, and therefore landlords have sold up as interest rates move significantly against them. However, the risk in the bank size, since the functioning or not of the rental market is not really of their concern, the only thing they care about would property prices plummet, because that might have a knock-on effect to the economy. That's not happened, as I've said, despite most of the other forecasters out there, 90+% of them, forecasting incredibly bearishly over a lot of the last 4 years. It just hasn't played out apart from anything else. And as I've banged on about, in fact, when you get into the data, when you look at it all, when you adjust for wages, when you adjust for inflation, property's cheap today. It's cheap, and it's cheaper than it has been for some years. But why bother with the truth? Because it doesn't make headlines, does it? So we don't really care about it, or some of us do anyway. So inflation masked everything, it absorbed it all, and instead what's happened is things have adjusted significantly in real terms after we've applied inflation, but hardly at all in nominal terms for the last 2 years. So, with that all in mind, into the breach. There's a million ways we could approach this. The bill itself is incredibly wordy, and line by lining the actual bill, before all the batting around has been done, amendments, committees, blah, 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 the likes, it's not going to provide a return on my time, it's not going to provide a return on your time, and so at this stage, I'm not going to do it. But on gov.uk, you do get about as promotional a piece as you ever get from the government, to be honest. When you have a big bill, you get some guidance around bills when they're proposed. And there is some guidance on the government website, which is where I'm concentrating my efforts for this week. It's a critique from me. It's a few words about unintended consequences that will follow. So this article on the site leads with the dramatic victory that is the ending of Section 21 evictions. And that's no surprise. This was the political point that was made. I don't really think they've got any idea about what will really be changed by the removal of Section 21 and the actual impact on things. I don't think it changes that much at all, to be honest with you, to give you a bit of a spoiler alert. Because apart from anything else, we're mostly talking about situations that do not occur in 90+% of tenancies. So let's frame it in the correct way. And I do appreciate some people have businesses that I know listen to and read the supplement where they issue way more Section 21s than we do. To be clear, we deal in the nicest possible way, usually secondary areas in terms of their economic activity, but we focus on working tenants who are likely not to be in the bottom 20 to 30% of the household earning demographic, because we're not focusing on the cheapest stuff in an area. We're focusing on cheap areas, but we're not necessarily focusing on comparatively cheap stock. As a general rule, as a general strategic rule, we have picked up differing stuff over the years, as you can imagine, when you've got hundreds of units. So the dramatic victory in the promotional piece of the ending of Section 21, and this is my immediate fear. There's a massive misunderstanding and misconception of why Section 21 is served in the first place. Firstly, it's so often used, and yes, in the spirit of the law, abused to regain possession when there absolutely is fault, even though it's supposed to be a no-fault notice. But there is fault in the eyes of the landlord. Secondly, the next best reason to regain possession, apart from rent arrears, is to sell a property, right? Compromise of private property rights, I believe 80% or more of the electorate as a rule would find unacceptable. And so this will have to appear in the new legislation anyway. Not that there is too much compromise on private property rights. There's a bit, but not really much that already exists in a fixed term tenancy situation anyway, to be honest. So I'm always wary of sort of dismissing these things as, oh, don't worry, it's not a big deal, because there's always the thin end of the wedge argument as well. And you will hear that from me today. I don't struggle to appreciate it. I definitely see it, but I think we need a broader discussion. So today I'm also going to refer to Scotland quite a bit. Only tenancies that started before the 1st of December 2017 in Scotland are still subject to what the Scots called an SAT rather than an AST. That was a short assured tenancy. And then since then, a prescribed form has always been used for tenants, so a government website template called a PRT, right? That has no fixed term. That's exactly what's going to go on in England. So if you think the UK proposals are bad, in Scotland, a tenant can give 28 days notice at any time, including on the day of move-in, with the landlords needing to give 3 months notice. So they have to give treble the amount of notice that the tenant does, and they have to jump through a number of hoops depending on the reason for the notice. And it's worth noting here, this has not crushed the system in Scotland. Indeed, from experience of owning and asset managing over 100 units in Scotland, although we had considerably fewer before the 1st of December 2017, it's changed very little at all. The vast majority of the fears were unfounded. What has ruined the sector in Scotland in recent years is rent increases, which have been linked to interest rate increases, of course, and massive cost increases for landlords, and the draconian response to those rent increases in the form of rent cap legislation. And Scotland have recently announced they will be persisting with rent cap legislation. This basically mandates how much rents can be put up each year. This is one of those perverse situations where, given that they've already made this massive mistake, they actually might as well carry on with this horrific policy. In order to woo investors back to the sector, they need a much more dramatic reversal than just scrapping rent caps. They need to actually actively incentivise people into the sector, which is just not happening under that current administration. It's so far ideologically away from where they are. Even if it would help the tenant, they ain't going to do it because they don't understand how the market works, right? So where's the evidence for all of this? Well, in recent lending data, Scotland was the least invested by percentage of anywhere in the UK for buy-to-let. Only £1 in every £20 lent at the moment in Scotland is for a buy-to-let purpose on secured loans. This is worse than £1 in every £13 in London, which is the next lowest throughout the UK. In 2016, which was the PRS peak year in England as well, in terms of its size, Scotland had 370,000 households in the PRS. Now they're at about 340,000, but the data is slow, so slow and so out of date. It's not managed by the ONS in Scotland. The horse will be so far gone past the gate by the time anything's done about it, and by the time they've got some workable data, all they'll be doing is navel gazing when they get it. So even so, look, if 1 in 7 households is a rental, but only 5% of mortgages contribute to buy to let, because that's the size of the PRS in Scotland, right? 14%. You can do the maths yourself. Ultimately, you cannot possibly be growing at any form of a sustainable rate if the population is growing, which of course it is. So Scotland gives us a good steer, I think, on how worried we really should be or shouldn't be about this whole situation. It also gives lawmakers a really good precedent about how they made these changes without upsetting the apple cart particularly. If they don't learn from this, and politically the main reason why they wouldn't is because politics is pathetic and they can't look at what the SNP have done or anybody has done and say it's any good. They can only look at what the Labour Party in Wales have done and say that's any good, even when it's rubbish, which I'll move on to in a second. But look, let's bear in mind from the start, both of those sectors, PRS in England, PRS in Scotland, are actively shrinking or have shrunk in the past 8 years. That's the government data, right? So that's where we're starting from before we consider anything else. So over to Wales, because both Scotland and Wales have a mandatory licensing system, like the one that's been proposed in the RRB. Wales made the old contracts change back in 2022. They've preferred the term occupation contract. So they did change things for everybody. They first of all said new tenancies will have to be, and then they set another date and said, right now, old tenancies will have to become occupation contracts, right? So that's exactly how it was in England before the Housing Act 1988 was passed to an extent, the older regulated tenancies. So Scotland have kept the ability to have the older SAT tenancies if you signed it before the 1st of December 2017, to be clear, which is what we've done in England to protect regulated tenancies pre-Housing Act 1988. Welsh rents have been rising, right? The ONS has got the regional data, and I don't talk about this very often because we're going down to a pretty deep dive level, but let me pull a few examples of some less well-off areas. This is new plus existing tenancies. So remember, this is the ONS data. They've got about 550,000 rentals around the UK that they monitor in terms of their rent levels. So about 23% of them turn over every year. So they go usually reset to market rent, as you can imagine. And then the other 77% are existing tenancies. So this is the best data by a million miles that anyone's got in the UK. So a few of these you might know. If you don't know much about Wales, you won't, but you'll just have to take it from me. They're not the economic massive engines. The last one is a little bit better off, but it's not Cardiff at the end of the day. So Merthyr Tydfil, 14.3% rent increase since January 2023. Torfaen, 19.6% rent increase since January 2023. Blaenau Gwent, 13.5%. Rhondda Cynon Taf, RCT, to those who know, 15.8% up. Neath Port Talbot, MPT, up 13.9. Swansea, up 17.1. And that data goes to July, so it's just over 18 months, right? It's 19 months of data, nearly 1% a month, more than 1% a month in Torfaen. So it's not great, is it, realistically? So it might not be as bad as it looks because this might be catching up to inflation, minimum wage rises and the likes, but it doesn't look like a very functional market, does it? So before we start to hold Scotland and Wales, especially Wales, up as examples of things done well, let's acknowledge that the largest single factor of late, by a massive amount, has been the change in interest rates. So let's dwell on that momentarily. The average interest-only mortgage, which average leverage landlord is using, is up over 100% in cost. If we look at BBR, which is the rate I discussed last week, the standard variable rate from the big banks, which is published and recorded by the Bank of England, sitting up at nearly 8% at the moment when it was down in the 3s a few years ago. So a huge increase on those sort of loans, the variable rates. If we just look at fixed pricing instead, and we start with 2019, so forget the ultra low interest rates of the pandemic, never sustainable. The average buy-to-let is up about 80% in cost. And because they're interest-only mortgages, that's just an 80% increase in payments. Doesn't look the same in a repayment situation, which is an important thing to understand. So huge increases that are now coming down, but coming down fairly slowly. So there's not going to be this dramatic sort of drop, right? So Let us recap. Even in the old environment, going back to 2019, the sector wasn't growing and it was tending instead towards shrinking a little bit.